No Shore in Sight, Chapter 1. A Quiet Return. The wind picked up as the fisherman drifted back toward the shore. The wooden hull of his boat groaned against the water, the gentle splashes of the oar cutting through the otherwise silent lake. It was late, much later than he had expected, but the calm of the water, with its familiar rhythm, soothed him. Rivers had spent years working the waters of Lake Fallow, a small, secluded body of water that felt more like a prison than a place of livelihood. It was his sanctuary and his cage all at once. At night, when the fog rolled in, the lake transformed into an eerie, formless expanse, with only the glint of his boat's lamp offering any semblance of clarity. Tonight, the fog was heavier than usual, and the dark silhouette of the pier was barely visible against the thick mist. As he neared the dock, his hand tightened around the oar. He could almost feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, suffocating him in ways that had become all too familiar. Then he saw them. A shadow moved along the edge of the pier, 3 men dragging something heavy. Rivers squinted through the mist, trying to make out what was happening. His first thought was that it was some sort of fishing accident, a mistake that happened all too often in these waters. But as the men reached the end of the pier, the glint of the moonlight caught the slick, red stains on the ground. Blood. His heart skipped. A chill ran down his spine as he realized what was happening. These weren't fishermen. They were killers. The men, unaware of his presence, continued their work, dragging the body toward the edge of the pier. Rivers froze. He had seen enough in his life to recognize the finality of what was unfolding. The men moved with a cold, practiced precision, and without a word they dropped the body into the water, its limbs twisting unnaturally before it sank beneath the surface. Rivers' grip on the oar tightened. He cursed under his breath. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't get involved. The best thing he could do was slip away and pretend he hadn't seen a thing. He shifted his weight, preparing to turn the boat around and head back into the fog. But then, one of the men turned. The man's eyes met Rivers'. The recognition was instant, though neither spoke. For a heartbeat, everything seemed to freeze. The air grew colder. Rivers didn't even move. The man's expression was unreadable, but the glint in his eyes told a different story. The man shouted something to his companions, and Rivers knew he'd been spotted. He had no choice. He pushed the boat further into the darkness, the fog swallowing him whole as the sound of shouting echoed faintly behind him. They had seen him, they knew, and now there was no going back. Chapter 2. Trapped in the fog. Rivers wasn't sure how long he had been out there, drifting in the center of the lake, the cold water lapping at the sides of his boat. The men had to be looking for him by now, but the thick fog made it impossible to know where they were. He dared not use his light, knowing that even the smallest glimmer would give away his position. His boat, a simple, weathered fishing vessel, was slow and fragile. It wasn't made for escape, nor was it equipped for anything that resembled safety. The men, on the other hand, were armed. Rivers had no doubt they would do whatever it took to silence him. No one would believe his story, and if he tried to run to the shore, they would catch him. The lake wasn't large, but it was small enough that there was no real cover, only stretches of barren, muddy shores, and the ever-present looming silhouette of the pier. There was no place to hide. He had to make a choice. The longer he stayed on the water, the more likely it was they'd find him. But docking at the pier, the one place he could safely rest, was also the one place that would expose him. Rivers sat still for a long time, the silence pressing down on him. He tried to focus on the sounds of the water, but his heartbeat was a constant drum in his ears. He needed to make a decision. His thoughts kept circling back to the same point. He had seen too much. He could feel his grip on the oar slipping. Exhaustion was creeping in, the cold air seeping into his bones. But no matter how hard he tried, his thoughts kept returning to the men on the pier, the way they had moved so deliberately, so calmly. They weren't just killers. They were professionals. Whoever they worked for, they were powerful, and they didn't leave loose ends. He had to get off the lake. He had to warn someone. He had a sharp sound broke through his thoughts. It was a distant splash, far enough away that it was impossible to pinpoint the direction. Rivers stiffened. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The men. They were out there. He shifted uncomfortably in the boat, the weight of the decision pressing down on him again. Time was slipping away. He couldn't wait forever. Chapter 3. The Killing Game. The hours passed slowly. Rivers had no idea what time it was anymore. The fog had thickened, and the entire world felt like a smothering blanket of gray. The stillness was oppressive. It felt like he was the last living soul on earth, drifting in an endless void of water and fog. The occasional splash from the shore or the faint call of a night bird felt like cruel reminders of his helplessness. He couldn't escape, and yet he couldn't stay still either. In the distance, the sound of the men's voices drifted across the water, faint but unmistakable. They were searching for him. They had to be. But there was no way they could know exactly where he was in this fog. He had the advantage, for now. But how long could that last? The voice in his head urged him to act, to think of something, anything, to turn the situation around. But every time he considered making a move, he realized it would be useless. The men were closing in. The fog was their ally, but it was also his enemy. He couldn't hide forever. Sooner or later, he would have to face them. And when that time came, there would be no more running. Chapter 4. The Waiting Game. The fog seemed to stretch endlessly before him, a blanket of gray that distorted the world around him. The boat rocked gently, and the only sound was the water lapping against the hull. His breath, shallow and irregular, blended with the rhythm of the lake. Time had become meaningless. Every minute that passed felt like an hour, every hour like a day. Rivers had no way of knowing how much longer he could endure the silence before it drove him mad. He forced his hands to remain steady on the oar, gripping it tightly as though it could anchor him to some semblance of sanity. The fog thickened further, swallowing everything in its path. His eyes darted nervously around, scanning the shadows, but nothing moved. The tension gnawed at him, each passing second laden with the weight of anticipation. He could hear the men's voices now, faint whispers carried on the wind, punctuated by the occasional splash as they tested the waters for his presence. They were still out there hunting him. He could feel it. He had to act. The longer he stayed in the center of the lake, the more vulnerable he became. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts, each possibility leading to a dead end. He couldn't stay in the boat forever, but returning to the shore, to that damned pier, was equally dangerous. The killers knew he had seen them. He had no doubt they would be looking for him, and when they found him, there would be no mercy. His eyes darted toward the shore, the silhouette of the pier barely visible through the mist. There was no place to hide, no escape. The killers had the lake covered, and the shore was the last place he wanted to be. But what choice did he have? He couldn't stay here. The boat was his prison. His pulse quickened as the thought hit him. The only way to survive was to make it to the shore before they reached him. But would they let him? Chapter 5. The Mind Games. Rivers started to row slowly, cautiously, back toward the shore. His hands trembled against the oar, his mind racing with fear. Every second felt like an eternity. As he approached the edge of the lake, his thoughts spiraled, tumbling into darkness. The killers knew he was coming. They would be watching the pier, waiting for him to dock. He thought of the faces he had seen when they first locked eyes, cold, emotionless, like hunters tracking their prey. The leader's eyes had been the worst, a calculating, predatory gaze that made Rivers feel like a fly in a spider's web. There was no one around. The town just beyond the edge of the lake was silent. No one would hear him scream. No one would care. They didn't care about him. They never had. That's when it hit him. They're coming for me, not because I'm a witness, but because they can. Because they can do whatever they want. The cold realization sent a shiver through his body. He had seen too much, but it wasn't just about what he had witnessed on the pier. It was about what he represented. A loose end, a potential threat, a man who could talk, who could expose them. They would kill him to silence him, and no one would ever know. He rowed faster now, panic building in his chest. The fear was almost suffocating. Each stroke of the oar felt like he was drawing closer to death. Then, through the fog, a figure appeared on the pier. It was the leader. He stood in the same spot where Rivers had first seen him, his silhouette stark against the dim light of the lamp. The man stood perfectly still, watching, waiting. Rivers froze. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. He had to move, but fear paralyzed him. The leader had spotted him. He knew what was coming. The man's voice, deep and unnervingly calm, floated across the water, carried on the mist. "Come on in, fisherman," the leader called. "We've been waiting for you." Rivers' hands shook on the oar, his grip slipping. The boat lurched, throwing him off balance. The splash of water as he regained control seemed to echo through the silence, louder than it should have been. The killer's voice continued, mocking him, twisting the knife of fear deeper. "There's nowhere to run, no shore in sight. You think you can escape, but you can't. You think you can hide, but you won't. You'll come back here one way or another, and when you do, we'll be waiting for you." Chapter 6. The Cold Truth. Rivers' mind reeled as he struggled to keep his composure. The killer's words were like poison, seeping into his thoughts, planting doubt and terror. How could he escape? How could he fight back? He was just one man in a tiny boat against men with guns, with power. He wasn't even sure he could make it to the shore without them catching him. But one thought kept repeating itself in his mind, louder than all the others. "There's no way out. You'll never make it." It was then that Rivers realized something far worse than the men chasing him. The real threat wasn't just death. It was the suffocating weight of his own fear. They had already won, not through force, but through the terror they had instilled in him. The fear was consuming him, stripping him of the will to act. For a long while, Rivers simply sat there, staring at the shore. His body felt heavy, his mind clouded. The cold of the night seeped deeper into his bones. He had no strength left to fight. His spirit, once hardened by years of labor on the lake, had crumbled under the weight of his terror. The fog had closed in again, and he could no longer see the pier. But he knew it was there, lurking just out of sight, like the killers. The truth gnawed at him, sharper than any blade. They would get to him. There was nowhere to hide, no escape. The only thing left to do was wait for them to come. Chapter 7. The End of the Line. By the time the first rays of sunlight began to break through the fog, Rivers had already made his decision. It wasn't one of bravery or heroism. It wasn't even a decision made with any semblance of control. It was a surrender. He turned the boat slowly, heading back toward the pier. He had no plan, no hope. Just the quiet acceptance that he had reached the end of the line. The killers would get to him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As he approached the pier, the leader's figure reappeared in the distance, stepping into the boat. A flicker of something, perhaps the glint of a rifle, was visible in the man's hand. Rivers didn't resist as the boat pulled in. He didn't look at the killer. He kept his eyes fixed on the murky waters beneath him. The boat scraped against the wooden beams of the dock. The leader stepped closer, his footsteps echoing. He looked down at Rivers, then back at the water. "Not so brave anymore, are we?" The man's voice was low, dripping with disdain. "You're just another man who thought he could escape." Rivers opened his mouth, but no words came. The realization washed over him. He had never truly escaped the lake. Not in all these years. He had always been trapped, always been a prisoner. With one final decisive motion, the killer raised his rifle. And as the cold steel pressed against Rivers' chest, he closed his eyes. The last thing he heard was the sound of the trigger being pulled. The Vanishing Hour. Chapter 1. The Cold Fog. The snow had begun to fall again in Loon Creek, Alaska, a relentless flurry that seemed to blanket the town in a constant, oppressive silence. The winter winds were fierce this time of year, and the days were growing shorter, stretching the long, cold nights even further. Detective Sarah Lee felt the weight of it all pressing in on her. This place, this town, was becoming harder to escape and harder to understand. It had started with a single disappearance, a man named Andrew Holt, who had lived in Loon Creek for almost a year. At first, Sarah had dismissed it. People went missing in small towns all the time. Some left voluntarily. Others found themselves in trouble, falling off the grid for one reason or another. But something about Andrew's disappearance didn't sit right. No one could recall seeing him leave. No one had any memory of when he'd last been around. The strangest part was that no one seemed to know much about him, not even his neighbors. He was a man of few words, a loner, and yet no one had any solid recollection of the last time they'd spoken with him. His house was empty, the door locked from the inside, with nothing missing, no signs of struggle. He had simply vanished. Sarah had begun her investigation with the usual questions, but as the days wore on, the sense of disquiet grew. Every lead she followed turned into a dead end. No one could recall any defining detail about him, not even the most basic information, like where he'd come from or what he did for work. His entire life, it seemed, had evaporated like fog on a morning too cold to breathe. Her partner Jimmy had been skeptical at first. He'd muttered something about small towns and how people would just leave without a word, but even he couldn't shake the oddity of the situation. "People just don't vanish without a trace, Sarah," Jimmy had said one morning over coffee, his brow furrowed in thought. "Not around here, especially not in a place this small." Sarah had agreed. There was something off about the case. It gnawed at her, a subtle discomfort that she couldn't quite name. Chapter 2. A Hollow Town. The days turned into weeks, and the investigation grew more frustrating. No one seemed to know anything about Andrew Holt's past. His records were a mystery. No birth certificate, no social security number, no record of his arrival in Loon Creek. He had no criminal history. He didn't even seem to have any friends or close contacts. To all intents and purposes, it was as if he had appeared out of nowhere. To make matters worse, the more Sarah dug, the more it felt like the town itself was closing in on her. People seemed to grow uncomfortable when she asked about Andrew. Their answers were evasive, and when they spoke, it was as though they were trying to convince themselves that they hadn't seen him, or worse, that they didn't know him. Sarah's frustration was growing, but the more she questioned, the more she felt as though she were stumbling through a fog, the edges of reality itself blurring. Something wasn't adding up, but no one would talk. She was getting nowhere. One evening, Sarah found herself at the Ice Hole, the local tavern, trying to shake off the unease that had settled into her bones. The regulars were gathered at the bar, talking in hushed tones about the weather and the latest gossip. Sarah wasn't particularly in the mood for small talk, but she needed to clear her head, and the warmth of the tavern was a welcome relief from the biting cold outside. As she sat down at the bar, the bartender, Paul, greeted her with a nod. Paul was a weathered man, having lived in Loon Creek for as long as Sarah could remember. He'd seen more than his share of strange things in this town. "Paul," Sarah began, swirling her glass of whiskey, "you ever heard of a guy named Andrew Holt?" Paul paused, then glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing. "Holt? Can't say I have," he replied, his voice cautious. "Why?" Sarah's gaze was sharp, her intuition telling her that Paul knew something he wasn't saying. "He's the guy who's been missing for the past few weeks. I've been asking around, but no one seems to know anything about him. His house is empty, his records are non-existent. It's like he never existed at all." Paul's eyes darted to the other patrons, who had suddenly gone quiet. They didn't look at her, but their tense postures spoke volumes. Sarah felt the shift in the room, the subtle tension building as if they were all part of some unspoken conspiracy. "I'm sure it's just some personal matter," Paul said with forced casualness. his voice betraying none of the calm his face tried to project. "Folks come and go here. Nothing to worry about." But Sarah could tell he was lying. She could see it in his eyes. Chapter 3. Unearthed Secrets. The following days were a blur of interviews with more townsfolk, each encounter growing more frustrating than the last. The people of Loon Creek had begun to act as though Sarah were the one who didn't belong. Whispers followed her everywhere she went, and the more she asked questions, the more she was met with awkward silence, or worse, outright hostility. As the investigation stretched on, Sarah decided to look deeper into the town's history. She dug through old town records, scouring the local archives for anything that could shed light on Andrew Holt's past. She combed through years of missing persons reports and old newspaper clippings, searching for any link that might explain his sudden, inexplicable disappearance. And then, in a dusty file marked with a faded label, she found something. An old case file from 10 years ago. A missing persons report. The name, Anna Sullivan, a young investigator who had vanished while working in Loon Creek. The similarities were striking. Anna, like Andrew, had no known family or close friends. She had arrived in the town under mysterious circumstances and had started asking questions about missing people, about strange disappearances in the town's history. The case had been closed when she too disappeared without a trace. Sarah's blood ran cold as she flipped through the case notes, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Anna had been investigating the very same thing Sarah was, missing people. And like Andrew, Anna had simply vanished. No explanation, no sign of struggle, no clues. Chapter 4. Breaking Point. Sarah's obsession with the case deepened. She began spending long hours in the archives, poring over records, finding more and more unsettling connections between past disappearances and the strange circumstances surrounding Andrew Holt. Each lead she followed seemed to twist into another dead end, another shadowy figure in the town's history, another life that had slipped through the cracks. As the days wore on, Sarah's grip on reality began to fray. Her colleagues at the station had noticed her growing disheveled appearance, the exhaustion etched into her face. Jimmy tried to pull her away from the case, urging her to take a break. "You're burning out, Sarah," he said, his voice full of concern. "You need to let this go." But Sarah couldn't. She had to know the truth. There was something hidden here, something the town was desperate to keep buried. She had to uncover it. One evening, as the sky darkened and the snow continued to fall, Sarah made a decision. She would go to Andrew's house again. She would search it one last time, even if it meant breaking in. Chapter 5. The Truth. The house was quiet, eerily so, as Sarah stepped through the door. It was the same as it had been before, frozen in time, untouched. But as she walked through the rooms, a strange sense of déjà vu washed over her. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the air was thick with the weight of unspoken secrets. Then in the attic, she found it. A stack of journals, each one filled with meticulous notes, each one belonging to Andrew Holt. The journals revealed the truth. Andrew had been a private investigator, hired by a family in the town to look into a long history of strange disappearances. The deeper he dug, the more he uncovered, an unsettling pattern of people vanishing, seemingly without reason, only to be forgotten by everyone around them. And like Anna before him, Andrew had become part of the town's silent history. Sarah stood in the attic, the weight of the discovery heavy in her chest. She now knew what had happened. The town had a secret, one that was older than anyone cared to admit. People came to Loon Creek, and when they stayed too long, they disappeared. It was as though the town itself demanded it, an invisible force that erased them, made them vanish from memory. Sarah realized in that moment that she wasn't just a detective. She was another part of the pattern, another person who would be forgotten by the town, her name fading into the snow. Chapter 6. The Final Choice. With the truth in her hands, Sarah faced a decision. She could leave Loon Creek, walk away from the case, and never look back, knowing that the town would swallow the truth once more. Or she could fight, expose the town's dark secret, and risk becoming yet another missing person. another forgotten soul in the snow. She closed the journal and stared at the pages for a long moment, the weight of her decision pressing heavily on her chest. The truth was clear, yet so terrifyingly elusive. This town, with its forgotten faces and silent whispers, was a place that consumed the curious. It erased them, just like it had erased Andrew, Anna, and so many before them. Sarah felt the pull of the truth in her gut. She had to fight. She had to make sure that whatever history Loon Creek was hiding would not claim her as its next victim. But as she turned to leave the attic, something stopped her. A noise. At first it was faint, just a soft creak from the floorboards below. But as Sarah stood still, trying to discern where it came from, it grew louder, closer. Someone or something was in the house with her. Her heart pounded. She wasn't alone. The air around her seemed to grow colder, the quiet of the house deepening. With a tight grip on the flashlight, Sarah slowly made her way down the narrow staircase, her breath shallow and quick. She moved silently through the house, the tension building with every step. Was it the police coming to check on her after hearing about her late nights at the station? Or was it someone else, someone who didn't want the truth to be uncovered? She reached the living room and paused. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, the dim light flickering erratically, as if the house itself was holding its breath. "Hello?" she called out, trying to steady her voice, but the words felt hollow in the thick silence. No answer. But then, from the corner of her eye, Sarah saw it. A figure, faint and blurry, moving past the doorway. It wasn't a person, at least not entirely. The figure shifted like a mirage, as if it wasn't really there at all, but something else. Her pulse raced. Instinctively, she reached for her phone, but as her fingers brushed against the screen, it flickered and died. The house, it seemed, had swallowed up all communication with the outside world. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to run, to get out of the house and away from whatever it was that had followed her. But she didn't. She couldn't. The truth was just out of reach, and she knew that if she left now, she might never understand what had happened to Andrew, to Anna, and to all the others who had vanished. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and crept forward, the faint rustling sound growing louder as she approached the doorway. The figure was standing there now, waiting for her, though its features remained blurry, distorted. It looked like a man, but there was something wrong about him, something that made the hairs on her neck stand up. "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, though her voice wavered. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond, but its eyes, wide and empty, seemed to lock onto her with an intensity that froze her in place. Suddenly, the figure reached out. No, not reaching, more like swaying, and Sarah flinched, instinctively stepping back. The air around her crackled with an inexplicable charge, as if the very atmosphere was bending under the weight of something that didn't belong. It took a step forward. The next thing Sarah knew, the room around her spun, the walls distorted, the edges of the room blurring, the figure looming closer. Her pulse hammered in her ears as the world spun out of control. And then everything stopped. She was standing in the middle of the room, but the figure was gone. The house was silent again, too silent. The air felt thick, the weight of it pressing in on her. Was it a hallucination? Had she been imagining things? It was possible, she thought. The stress, the exhaustion from the investigation had begun to take a toll. Maybe it was all in her head. But as she glanced back toward the hallway, Sarah saw it, a piece of paper lying on the floor, halfway across the room, as though it had been placed there deliberately. She walked over and picked it up, her hand trembling slightly. It was a letter, a single page, hastily scrawled with no return address. "Sarah, you've come too close. Leave, now. If you stay, you will be forgotten." She froze. The letter, the warning, it was too real. The message was clear, and it was meant for her. She had already crossed the line. The town was not going to let her expose its secrets. Her mind raced, but she could no longer deny what was happening. Loon Creek wasn't just a small, quiet town. It was a place that erased people. It erased memories. And now Sarah was a part of that erasure. She could feel it in her bones. The town had seen her. It had noticed her. And it would not let her go. Chapter 6. Vanishing Point. Back at the station, Sarah sat at her desk, the weight of the letter still pressing on her. She had gone back to her apartment, slept fitfully, and come to work the next day. But it was clear that things had changed. The world felt wrong. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the air was heavier, more oppressive. Her co-workers were going about their usual routines, but their faces seemed unfamiliar, as though their identities had blurred, as though they were, just like Andrew and Anna, slipping away, fading into the town's forgotten history. Jimmy came over, his face full of concern. "You okay, Sarah? You look like you haven't slept in days." Sarah nodded, forcing a smile. But inside, a gnawing feeling told her that everything she had ever known was unraveling. The phone rang, and she instinctively reached for it. Her breath caught as she answered. The voice on the other end, muffled, distant. "Sarah Lee?" The voice was familiar, but it had a hollow tone, as though it was coming from the other side of a great divide. "Yes," she responded, her throat tight. There was a long pause, and then the voice spoke again, softer this time. "You're next." The line went dead. Her heart stopped, and she dropped the receiver in shock. The phone echoed in the empty room, a harsh reminder of the town's grip on her. She had been marked. No one could escape it. No one ever had. And in that moment, Sarah understood. She was already lost. The town would erase her, just like it had erased Andrew and Anna, just like it had erased so many others. There would be no case, no resolution. Loon Creek would swallow her whole, and when the town had its fill, no one would ever remember her name.